Okay, so this is a tutorial on an Emily Dickinson poem called Hope is the Thing with Feathers. And just to say a little bit about Emily Dickinson, she grew up in an area very close to where I grew up in Massachusetts. She was reclusive, which meant that um, she didn't she wasn't seen very often in public. She was very quiet. She stayed by herself. Quarantining and self-isolating would not be a problem for Emily Dickinson because that's what she did anyway. So she was kind of a solitary soul, but very brilliant. And so much of her poetry, she wrote hundreds of poems that were not discovered until after her death by her sister-in-law, who found them in her room. And they were tucked in places. They were tucked under her bed. They were tucked in little crannies of the room and so forth. And they came up with about 700 and something poems that she had written and then published afterwards. But very little of her poetry was published while she was alive. So, and then after, posthumously, but she became one of the greatest poets in American history. So she lived during the Civil War era and just after the Civil War era. So a lot of her poetry was written in like the 1860s, 1870s. All right. So anyway, Hope. Hope is a Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. The sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never, in extremity, it asked a crumb of me. So you see that Emily, this is 3 stanzas, and each stanza says something a little bit different. Now, what you probably have noticed, hopefully, is that the extended metaphor throughout this whole poem is the metaphor of hope and a bird. So there's that comparison, that hope is a bird, and the bird is perched on the soul and is always singing to us. It never stops. So what's implied is that hope is something that it's a gift from God. It's a birthright that we all have because it is something that is perched in the soul. And so, of course, the soul is with us our whole lives. It is a gift from the divine, and so would hope be from Emily Dickinson's perspective. Now, in the second stanza, she talks about this how it's a sweet sound, and that it just continues to sing even in the strongest of storms, and where it says that could abash the little bird, you almost want to say bash the little bird, right? But abash means, if you are abashed, it means that you are somehow embarrassed of what you're doing, but the bird is never embarrassed by its song, is never embarrassed. So in other words, in facing the strongest, most dangerous storm, hope is never embarrassed about being hopeful. There is no embarrassment. And in the third stanza, I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea. So here, we're talking about when people are suffering the harshest conditions, and of course, all over the world. So, the strangest seas, the chillest land. So she's heard it everywhere, and she's certainly heard it perhaps putting herself in a position of being, throughout the seasons, in the coldest seasons, and on the strangest sea or on the most ominous sea. And yet, in extremity, it I'm sorry, and yet never in extremity. So it never asked a crumb of me. So hope, basically what she's saying is that hope never asks for anything in return. Hope just keeps singing and singing and singing and singing. So that's Hope is a Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickenson.